Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome to our webinar on, I will share my screen so that everyone can see. Let's see here. And Ashley, if you can, let me make sure that I am presenting. Is everybody able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So we've got our webinar today on software security for executives, and with me today is Ashley Schwartau of the Security Awareness Company, and this is really designed for people who maybe don't code every day. Perhaps you are in the business side of your company. You know that security is a really big, important thing, but you're trying to figure out what is it that you need to know. So Ashley and I are going to go over some kind of basic principles of software security to help keep you and your company safe. So who are we and why should you listen to us? Well, so I am the CEO of Corgibytes, and Corgibytes is a company that specializes in modernizing and maintaining existing software applications. So we deal with security, a lot from the just basic foundations of building good software. LinkedIn named me as a top 10 professional under 35 in the software category. And I'm also, I keynote regularly around the world about the importance of software maintenance and modernization. And I also have a podcast called LegacyCode.rocks, where we've got about 35 episodes right now. We're always recording more, where we talk about the nuances of working with existing software, specifically when it comes to being very complex. So there's some good security stuff there. And Ashley, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself too.
Hi, my name is Ashley Schwartau, and I'm the creative director of the Security Awareness Company. The Security Awareness Company has been around since the early 90s. It was founded by Win Schwartau, my dad, and we specialize in creating security awareness training content and helping organizations plan, launch, and manage their security awareness programs. And I've been in this business my entire life because this started as a family business. So it's something I've grown up around and have become very passionate about, and I've been the creative director of SAC since 2009. So I have seen so many security awareness programs, from the most amazing successful ones to just some really bad ones. And so I'm going to share some of my experiences and knowledge with everyone today.
And you also directed the documentary Hackers Are People Too.
I did, back in 2008, I think it was. I felt like I needed to practice my video editing skills and wanted to do something for a community that I've grown up with and love. And so I created a short documentary called Hackers Are People Too, and it premiered at DEF CON in 2008.
Fantastic. All right, so most companies are software companies, whether they want to be or not. So this is kind of the basic premise. A lot of times when we talk to companies, they identify as a healthcare company or a financial company or an e-commerce company. But we are quickly approaching the age where every single company, regardless of what you do, you are going to have some underlying software that runs your business. It's almost impossible in this day and age to be a business and to not have to consider software. So that means that if you are running a company, so if you're an executive, founder, VP, that you have to think about software security whether you want to or not. I know this was my background. I came from kind of the business and marketing and business law kind of things. And there have been very basic kind of software principles that you have to get your head around so that you can make sure that you understand the strategic importance, you can understand the risks, and then that way you can budget appropriately so that the technicians can do their job. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So first, what is software security and why should I even care? So let's just start there. So I like to think of it kind of like a house. And, there's when you have a house, right, you've got the door that you lock, right? And I tell this story of the Equifax breach where, let's put this in terms of a metaphor. So let's imagine that you owned a home and the company that you built the lock that built the lock for your front door, they sent you a, registration notice and said, there might be some recalls on this. Maybe it's one of those fancy ones where, you can punch in a code. And so, you never send it in because you're really busy. I know I sometimes forget, because it falls to the bottom of the to-do list. And then, a few years later, there's a recall, and the company that discovered, that manufactured the lock, they don't have a way to get in touch with you. So that's kind of the first line of defense. You never signed up, so you just didn't get notified that there was a vulnerability. And then maybe a few months later, you see that there are news reports of thieves, and they're going up to houses, and they had this lock, this specific lock, because the thieves have figured out, the houses that have this vulnerability are easier to break into. But, you still ignore it. You're like, yeah, I know. And it just falls to the bottom of the to-do list. You've got a bajillion other things on your plate. But then you come home 2 months later and you found that your home was broken into. And imagine that you have a big filing cabinet where you keep the names, the addresses, the social security numbers, the credit history of 143 million of your friends. And 4 months after the break-in, you decide, what, I should probably let my friends know that my house was broken into. And people will probably be pretty angry. I think that's kind of what happened with the Equifax breach. So, we'll get into it, but essentially what happened was there was a dependency that was never upgraded in Equifax, and they didn't, for whatever reasons, and that we can get into a little bit later. But you can kind of think about it, just like you would a house. And when we think about software security, we sometimes think, it's a technology problem. But we also like to think of it, it's just a pure technology problem, or is it also a people problem? There's an acronym in the software development world called a PEBCAC problem, which is that the problem exists between keyboard and chair. And so, that's essentially what we're talking about here is it purely the technology, or is it that the people either don't understand the value of security, or the company doesn't have the governance or the policies in place to actually make security a priority? And Ashley, I'd love for you to chime in too here on your experience here.
Sure. One thing that I always like to talk to people about when it comes to people assuming that security is a technology problem is thinking about it like a car. So we have a house, now we're going to think about it like a car. Would you let your 15-year-old unlicensed kid drive your brand new Lexus, like your super fancy tech awesome car? No, you wouldn't, because that kid hasn't had any training. That kid doesn't know how to drive. He probably doesn't know the rules of the road. So why do you let your untrained employees use your technology and networks? If you have outdated or vulnerable software that's not being patched or maintained, and you're letting untrained employees use that software, and these untrained employees who may or may not follow policy, you have a much larger problem, and your very simple tech problem is now a tech and people problem. And so the thing that I think people forget is that security isn't ever just one thing. It's not just people or technology. It's this balance of the people who use the technology that lets us do our business, and then the processes or policies that provide the guidelines for the people using the technology. So back to the PEBCAC, the problem that exists between your keyboard and chair, the question then becomes, how do you make that person sitting in the chair your strongest asset instead of your weakest link?
Absolutely. So, why should I care about security? So let's get a little bit deeper into what are the risks. If you decide to let all of your security problems, just fall to the bottom of the to-do list, because, it can be very, very tempting to think that you've got so many more important things. But it's important to know that, and to do that consciously, that if you choose to ignore this, these are the risks that you're ending up with. So first is that you could lose your business, or you could get fired. This is very common with CEOs. They're the ones who have to take the fall. And if this is a business that you own, perhaps it's a homegrown company, usually this is a PR disaster. It's, a ruined reputation. So lost, customers' trust, lost money, your company's intellectual property, that could end up in the hands of your competitors. In addition to, losing your customers' trust, there's also losing your employees' trust, the culture. If the people who are working for you don't feel like, you're taking this seriously, money could end up in the hands of bad guys, right? People who we don't want. And we understand that, mistakes get made and accidents happen. But one thing is to think of, like, do you have a disaster recovery plan? So, similar to, if you live on the West Coast, near a fault line, you likely have a, hurricane, or an earthquake evacuation plan. I live in the mid-Atlantic, so we have hurricanes that hit every once in a while. So, we've got a hurricane kit, so being aware and saying, okay, if something does happen, how are we going to react? Investigating and mitigating breaches takes time and resources. So are you putting money into your strategic plan? Are you making this a priority where you're actually putting dollars behind it? And then also, stress is already an all-time high. Why do you want to ignore it or why do you want to add to that kind of stress by ignoring security? So, thinking of this as, what risks do we face? I think this is a list of just the number of, or just a few of the companies that had a major data breach in 2017. And some of them, like Anthem and Target, have had data breaches regularly. The one that's kind of top of mind right now as we're recording this is Equifax, which was breached a little bit before. And I'll go over that because it's so top of mind. So, you heard the metaphor before, but now let's look at kind of what happened. So in March 6th of 2016, there was a flaw discovered in what's called Apache struts, which is the framework, like it's, think of it as almost kind of the plumbing of an application, right? So it touches all different parts of an application. So in March 16th, the flaw was discovered. And in March 9th, the hackers started exploiting that vulnerability. And Equifax knew this. They knew that hackers were actively trying to break in because of this vulnerability. And in mid-May, they successfully did, because Equifax did not patch that specific vulnerability. Now that happened in kind of March, May, and it wasn't until September that Equifax announced that 143 million accounts were exposed. And this is all very sensitive data. Equifax is one of the biggest consumer, so they've got consumer credit, so they have social security numbers and lots of very, very, very sensitive data that and so on September 26th, the Equifax CEO had stepped down. So, this all came from, essentially not fixing one small vulnerability in their software. Now, Target and Anthem, those tended to be more like people. It was very similar. We don't have the exact details reported as we do with Equifax in terms of what the specific vulnerability was. But there were people, and there are always people who are actively trying to hack into your system. And the larger that you are, the bigger a risk this becomes. And so a bigger part of your budget this needs to be. So let's look at kind of a smaller company. So this is a company that is a nonprofit of ours. And one of the things that Corgibytes does is we focus on helping companies modernize their software and update it. So the company had started working with us about 2 years ago. And so immediately, we did an audit. That's the first step that we do with pretty much all of our clients. And we noticed that there were some kind of glaring security vulnerabilities. And so we focused on updating them. This client had been running most of their software from a laptop in the office, running on Windows XP. And when in May of 2017, so around the same time as kind of Equifax, there was a hack called WannaCry. And essentially what would happen is it targeted companies that were running a specific version of Windows on XP, and they would take over the company website, and this would be what all of the clients would have seen. And the way that you had to get out of it was you had to spend $300 in Bitcoin. Now this client it's a well-known nonprofit, how would that have affected their donors' trust? So thinking about their costs, they've spent much less in updating their software because this did not happen to them. This happened with, it would have, but because they spent money upgrading and making sure that their software was patched and was viable, they made sure that this didn't happen. And that, I think, is one of the challenges of software security a little bit too, is that when things are going really well, we don't see, like, things are just kind of normal. There's no drama, right? And that's the goal. That's what we want. And sometimes in society these days, it can feel like you need to have all of this like action and high drama. But when it comes to software security, really what you want is you just want things to be slow and steady and smooth, and you want operations to proceed as normal. So we were really proud of when, as soon as we saw this come out, we double checked all of our work, and, within a couple hours of this particular WannaCry vulnerability being reported, we were able to tell our client, like, this is something that you don't have to stress about because we already took care of it. And that's exactly what you want is we're monitoring, we saw it, but you don't have to worry about it because we've already been proactive. And so now Ashley has a case study from the Security Awareness Company.
So one of the things that Andrea was just talking about was someone coming to them in a very preventative mode, saying, I don't want this to happen, so what can I do to prevent it? Unfortunately, we often have the opposite happen to us. We have clients coming to us in a very reactionary mode, like, oh no, this just happened, now I need to do something about it. And I have 3 quick examples of different types of clients and who've come to us for different reasons. The first one is in that very reactionary mode. They had a pretty bad phishing attack happen to their organization, and they came to us like demanding, like, we need phishing training right now. And it's like, it's a little too late, right? But all they wanted to do was focus on phishing training. They didn't want to do any other kind of awareness. They're just like, no, they fell for phishing. Let's focus on phishing. And we don't believe in siloing security awareness topics like that. That's not going to be a very effective way to educate your users. Back to the car analogy, if you fail your driver's ed test because you rolled through a stop sign, are you only going to practice, coming to a stop at a stop sign? No, you're going to practice looking both ways before moving forward. You're going to look in your mirrors. You're going to practice looking for blind spots. You're going to practice coming to a nice slow stop and then going forward without gunning. You're going to practice things that are related. So you shouldn't just try to silo your training and say, oh, this is our one problem, this is our only problem, and so now let's only educate them on this, or let's only think about technology or software solutions from this angle. You have to think broader. So then, from a more broad standpoint, we sometimes have clients who come to us who are like, well, we need to train them on policy. We need to teach everyone compliance and policy, and that's all they want to teach, which, yes, it's broader than just one topic, but it's still very narrow-minded. And still using that siloing mindset that just isn't going to be very effective when you're educating your employees. This particular client wanted us to cut literally everything that wasn't policy specific. So like, don't teach them how to be safe at home. Don't teach them how to secure their families and prevent identity theft from happening to them. Like, only teach them what happens about policy. 6 months later, they ended up having a massive breach because it came down to someone having too much access to something they weren't supposed to have access to. And they didn't technically violate policy, but they didn't really know what to do, or they didn't know any better because they weren't educated on the surrounding topics or the risks associated with privileged access. But they technically didn't violate the rules, but they still caused this massive problem. All because of this like very narrow mindset when it comes to, they were being somewhat preventative, but still not quite as broad scope as we encourage people to be. what Andrea's company had is what we have sometimes, and we love to see, is when clients come to us saying, hey, our competitors had this massive breach happen to them, and we don't want to end up like them. We don't want our brand damaged. What can we do to prevent this kind of thing from happening? And that's when we work with them to develop a comprehensive security awareness training program that will use this proactive preventative approach as opposed to just reactionary or siloing topics. And so you have to think about, well, which type of company are you going to be? Are you going to be reactionary? Are you going to be policy only, policy driven? Or are you going to try and prevent things from a broad approach?
So now let's bring this down to your organization. So we've learned a little bit about kind of what software security is, kind of some case studies, and now we're going to start diving into the details a little bit. So the first, like you've just heard, is don't wait for the house to be on fire before you start fighting it. When it comes to security, and really when it comes to software maintenance in general, is the best kind of prevention. The best kind of fighting is prevention and being proactive. So, I like to say, make sure that things are soaked ahead of time and make sure that you've got your good policies. So, making sure that you're thinking about this before, a big issue arises. So now, let's talk about kind of how software is typically thought of. It's very, very common when I talk to organizations that they think that they have to focus on features all the time. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Investors tend to put a big focus and a big emphasis on feature development. And so that's where the majority of the budget goes. And I've seen companies who put 100% of their budget towards just developing features. Now let's think of that in terms of the house, right? And bringing it back to the house metaphor. That means that you're never spending any money or any time or any resources on cleaning up, on repairing, on maintaining. And if you do that, your house is going to be a disaster, right? And it's going to be harder to clean it up. The best thing to do is to set aside a maintenance budget and a maintenance routine and just commit to it. Consistency is a really, really, really important part of building and scaling software in a secure way. And think of this as kind of adulting, right? Like Ashley and I were joking. So I am buying my own house for the first time in a couple of weeks. And now it's like, okay, I have to set aside, a percentage of my mortgage, and I put it in a maintenance account every single month because I know that I'm going to have to replace the windows. I'm going to have to take care of plumbing. I'm going to, have to take care of this. It's not just about painting rooms and buying new furniture or things like that. It can be tempting and it can be a lot of fun, but there are going to be things that go wrong. So the best way we like to describe it is to set aside a maintenance budget and a modernization budget for your organization to make sure that things like with Equifax that the vulnerabilities are patched as soon as they're discovered. Things shouldn't wait for a long time. And if you have any questions, get a company to run an audit. And depending on the type of tech stack that you're running, there are a lot of different tools that you can use to just monitor what's going on. So this should be a part, of your software development plan. It should not be just on features. Also making sure that you're incorporating security features into the foundations of whatever it is that you're building, instead of focusing on things after the fact. So again, this is making sure, for example, that you're using, the latest stable versions of different languages and frameworks and platforms, and looking to see if there are any vulnerabilities before you develop. And then also doing things like updating your vulnerabilities and dependencies, running penetration tests, white hacking, paying down technical debt. So I'll touch a little bit on kind of what each of these are. So the vulnerabilities, this is what you see all the time. So if you own an iPhone or an Android, like most people own a smartphone these days, and almost all the time with your applications, you have to update them. And yes, it's annoying, and it's, part of what keeps you safe and secure. So the vulnerabilities and dependencies, it's updating them on a regular release cycle. And there are a lot of different technical ways that can happen. But the biggest thing for executives is making sure that is a priority, that has a budget behind it, and making sure that, you're investing in making sure that your software is modernized. Penetration tests and white hacking. So penetration tests are sometimes called pen tests. So if you hear that, that's kind of what it is. But that's digging in and getting people to actually try to hack into your system. So there's I think the best known company is called HackerOne, that does these different types of white hacking and penetration tests. And they will go in, and you can kind of create a campaign, and you can say, okay, I want you to try to hack into my system. And you pay people. So then that way, you can find out a lot of information that way by getting people to try to be vulnerable. And think of this again as training, right? You're constantly poking at the system to see, where it's vulnerable. And paying down technical debt, this is kind of the normal cleanup work, right? So this is the, in the house analogy, this is, cleaning up after yourself after you have a party, right? And in the software world, this is things like deleting comments that don't need to be there, or, avoiding duplication in your code base. There are a lot of things that make code kind of messy. And we want to make sure that our code bases are nice and clean, they're easy to test, and that we continue to invest time in making them clean and easy to work with, because then it's going to be much, much, much easier, and it's going to be a much better use of resources to update our vulnerabilities and dependencies, to run penetration tests. If you've got a very complex code base that's hard to work with, then doing those types of activities is going to be pretty expensive. And then also, like Ashley said, is thinking about your entire ecosystem. So not just encryption, or not just phishing training. The way that I describe encryption in the, kind of in the house metaphor, encryption is kind of like a safe, right? It's a safe with a key on it. So, important information, it can be harder to break into, but, somebody can still break into the house, but they can't get to the data, right? Or, if they have a hammer, right? So it just depends on kind of the style of encryption. So encryption is one type of security measure, but it is so much more. And making sure that you've got kind of a good, healthy maintenance program, and that you've thought about this kind of from the strategic level, and then everyone on your team knows kind of what the expectations are and how they can implement it. So, what is a security policy? So, Ashley and her team focus on this a lot. So I'm going to turn this back over to her so that she can go into the details of what a good security policy should look like.
Yeah, one of the things that we see more often than I wish is companies who don't have a well thought out security policy, or a policy that doesn't necessarily include all the types of guidelines that it needs to, or maybe one that doesn't address all types of users. So one of the main reasons that you need a security policy, and a good comprehensive one, is because you need rules in place to set expectations for behavior within the organization, and for your users to know what they're doing while using company devices and company networks. And more importantly, you need consequences for when they don't follow policy. Because if you're telling them, oh, you shouldn't do X, but then when they do X, literally nothing happens, like, why would they ever not do X? So there needs to be an actual policy, a clear one, and it needs to be enforced. Now, a lot of the companies that have not had policies in place, or who think, oh, we don't really need a security policy, what happens then? Well, if you don't have one in place, your users don't know what's expected of them. They have no guidebook for situations in which they might have questions, so they're just going to guess or, do whatever they think is best. And if you're not training them, what they think is best is probably not great. You're leaving tough decisions up to your users when you should be making them yourselves as executives or upper level management. And then you have no recourse for if something does go wrong. You can't punish them because they didn't know that something was wrong in the first place. So you're losing a lot of power by not having policy. And then if you have a policy and if you're not enforcing it consistently and actively, you're losing power and credibility, because now you're like a parent who never lives up to their threats. If you talk back to me one more time, I'm going to ground you. But then if you never actually ground them, the kid's going to keep talking back to you. So not enforcing a policy is almost as bad as not having one. And then if you have a policy where you've just like cobbled together a bunch of rules that you think, oh, well, this might work, and I saw this over here, now let's like throw all these things together, you're going to end up with a bunch of arbitrary rules and contradictions and probably things that aren't like context specific to your organization or that don't work within your culture. And in those cases, you're going to end up with people who are confused, maybe intimidated by the lack of coherency of your policy, and then that could lead them to making poor decisions. And then if you have arbitrary rules, speaking from experience, I don't like people telling me what to do if there's not a good reason behind it. So why would I do it? You have to give them the context and the purpose behind the rules so that they don't end up acting out of, I think I know better than the stupid policymakers. So when you're building your security policy for your entire organization, you need to write policies that are purposeful with the intent very clear and explained. And you should probably do so in normal English language, not like legalese that's going to confuse or, frustrate people and that probably lawyers don't even understand. And you need to make your consequences, what the consequences for not following those policies are, you need to make those very clearly stated, and then you actually need to enforce them so that people take security seriously, take you seriously as leaders, and understand that security is very important to the organization as a whole. And lastly, one thing that your policy has to include, and I don't know why this isn't like number one for like most organizations, but you have to have an internal 911 system. If something goes wrong or something seems off, or if there's even something that could potentially lead to a data breach or some sort of problem, you want people to report those things. And it should be policy to do so, but you need to make it simple and easy for them to do it. It shouldn't be like, oh, click here on the internet and then like drop down in this menu and now I'm going to go over here and now email this. Like it should be super simple. 2 clicks, 10 seconds. That's a really good mantra to keep in mind. If it takes longer than a couple clicks or 10 seconds, I'm going to figure out another way to do it, and it's probably not going to be policy compliant, or maybe I just won't do it at all. So make incident response a priority, make it part of your policy, and take the time to actually build and write out a thoughtful, purposeful policy.
Yep. And on top of that too, it's finding people within your organization that can help you, right? So as the executive, it doesn't necessarily be that you need to be writing the policy, but you need to be setting the initiative and saying, this is of strategic importance to our organization and it needs to get done. So a lot of times it's going to be delegating to either people on your team or finding different companies that can help you write these and can review what you've got. But there are lots of different companies out there who can help with this. But, as an executive, it's your job to make sure that you are delegating and that you are making this a priority for your organization.
And asking those people, your techs and other executives and people who know more than you do about certain subjects for their input, because that's why you hired them. You hired them because they know something you don't know and can do something you can't do. So enlist their help and make them part of the process.
Absolutely. Oops. So a little talk about budget. So a lot of times I hear, oh, well, I don't have the money to spend on software security, or I don't have the money to spend on modernization. And one of the things that I think is really important, this is a picture of Andrew Carnegie. And one of my hobbies is to study British literature and British history. And one of the things that when I was taking a class, I learned is that one of the reasons that England didn't maintain their lead in the Industrial Revolution is because they never modernized their equipment. And one of the biggest reasons that Andrew Carnegie became such a titan of industry is because he was ruthless about modernization. He made sure that his factories were always upgrading their tool set, were always using the most modern equipment. And that is the mindset that enabled him to continually innovate, to continually find new opportunities, and to continually take advantage of situations and pull out ahead. So, and this is what we see in the software world too. The companies that continually invest in modernization tend to do much better from a fiscal standpoint. It becomes much easier to make repairs or to implement policies because things are much more streamlined. But if you never put budget in things, then your competitors will race ahead of you. And so it's important to recognize that just because you build something once, it doesn't mean that it's going to be done forever. The idea is that in the software industry, there is a philosophy called continuous improvement, which means that every single day you're working to make your software better than it was yesterday. And this is a philosophy that's really taking hold. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was I release once and then, I don't have to stress about it for 18 months. And those days are gone. We are developing software in sometimes real time. And the closer that you can align your organization with the philosophies of continuous improvement, the better ahead you're going to be in making sure that you are that your organization is prepared in the event of a breach. So the first set is just kind of a philosophical one and making a commitment to, okay, we're always going to modernize our equipment and we recognize that this is a strategic advantage. And so then once you do, it's like assessing what are your goals and needs, where are your biggest strengths and weaknesses? I'm always a big fan of doing a good old SWOT analysis. So doing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then when you think about kind of where should you invest in specifically when it comes to software security, there's kind of 4 different kind of buckets that you can put. The first is in modernization and upgrades. So this is, like we said, making sure that those dependencies, that your vulnerabilities are patched, your dependencies are upgraded. That's just kind of the normal, like, decluttering, vacuuming the kitchen, those kinds of tasks that just, you should make sure that they are a priority. And we've had it before where we talk to technical teams and the engineers on a project will ask them why, all of their software is so outdated. And they will say, most often the reason that people don't update them is because there is a mandate from the business or a mandate from, above that they are not to spend any time or resources upgrading. And that can lead to huge, when we do audits, we see, oh my gosh, this is not good. So making sure that it's very, very clear where the money is and having a clear budget for modernization. The next is maintenance and testing, right? So making sure that you're investing in kind of those different types of penetration testing, that you're one of the resources on the software side is automating your testing, right? So instead of relying just on manual tests, that you're building out what's called an automated test suite. So if you build, a feature, then you can test and see if there's any, changes that are going to affect or if that's going to release a bug into the system. So there are lots of ways that you can introduce automated testing, and that really makes the development a lot more efficient. And then finally, the second 2, and so I'd say the first 2 are kind of like where Corgibytes comes in. The second 2 are really where Ashley comes in. So the policies and governments, and then also training people. So Ashley, if you want to kind of talk about those and why they're of such strategic importance and, kind of the budget that people might want to consider for those.
Yeah, so a lot of times, like we talked about earlier, security is often boiled down to being a tech issue. So that's where a lot of the budget ends up going towards the technology. But I always encourage people to make sure they're investing in their people, not only, making sure that you have enough people to work on the problems that you have. Make sure that you're not saddling the IT guy with all of these other security responsibilities. Have a dedicated security team, have a risk assessment team, have a security awareness department. Don't just say, oh, that guy works on computers, he can do all of that. Because no security program or risk assessment program can be done by one or two people. You need a whole team of people. And when you're hiring those people, you have to hire the right people. And often that means rethinking conventional hiring practices, because some of the most talented and brilliant security professionals out there are not your traditional corporate employees. They didn't go to college. They might not have certifications. They might be covered in tattoos and piercings and prefer working at like 2 a.m. rather than a 9 to 5 structure. But those are the people who are going to help you the most. They're the ones who will be able to look at vulnerabilities in a new way and think of new ways to educate your users. So to get the right talent for your team and to protect your networks with the right people, you're going to have to probably step outside your comfort zone in terms of hiring practices. And then in terms of investing in the future of your people, empower them through education. So you have to set aside part of your budget for training, because you need your users, all of them, from executives, techs, down to your day-to-day people who barely know how to use computers. You need all of them to behave like a human firewall, but they're not going to be able to do that unless you teach them. And unfortunately, security is not something that's taught in schools. I'm assuming one day it's going to have to be, like reading, writing, arithmetic, and cybersecurity. But until that is something that's taught from a young age, unfortunately, the responsibility of training users falls to organizations who employ them, especially when it comes to like compliance and policy. So you need to make sure that you're setting aside budget, not only for having enough of the right people, but for educating and empowering those people as well.
Absolutely. So talking about knowing your assets and your people. So thinking, well, we kind of split this out into two different ways. So on the technology side, one of the best tools that we have for kind of understanding and learning and embracing this idea of continuous improvement is to use a tool called a retrospective. And it should be said that there is a prime directive that goes on with the retrospective. So any Star Trek fans out there, it's not that prime directive. It's a little bit different. It's the prime directive of a retrospective is that no matter what happened, everyone did their best given the resources and information that they had at the time. Right? So this is something that is great to do, let's say, after a breach, right? After something happens that you can really learn from. So the goal is to get rid of shame and blame. So this is not a tool for, kind of pointing fingers and saying this was so-and-so's fault. Instead, you're using these 3 questions to really analyze the situation. And then, it's really powerful. What we do at Corgibytes is we do a retrospective every single week with every single client. And then we also do it internally as a team. And this helps us kind of look at what went wrong, what could go better, and what should change. So realizing that we need to adapt to changing environments, changing, the world is just changing so fast. So this is something that you can develop today. You can start getting your team together and saying what went wrong, what could go better, and what should change, and just making sure that you're asking those questions on a regular basis and documenting things. And because sometimes it can be really daunting to say, oh my gosh, I have to completely change everything right now. And this can help you move in the right direction and making sure that you are continuously making things better rather than trying to get this beautiful panacea of a policy put into place and having everything done before, and everything figured out and what all the requirements are going to be before you start implementing. Using a retrospective means that, you start making things better today. And then every single day you're going to commit to making things better, more so than that was the day before. Another is aligning business and engineering teams so that they're strategically aligned. And I can't say this is probably the biggest thing that we see, is that the business team doesn't understand the value of software maintenance and modernization. And so then that means that the engineering team they become really frustrated because they start saying we are at risk, and the business team will go, well, just don't worry about it. And that can create a lot of power dynamic struggles. And so it's important to make sure that everyone recognizes that we are all, whatever organization you're working for, everyone is on the same team, right? So making sure that, the business people are learning from the engineers, and the engineers are learning from business people. Executive teams are learning from everyone. And that, we all understand what the importance is. We all understand, kind of what the vision is and what the goals are. And that is, I think, the biggest thing that an executive can do. As an executive, your job is to really set the vision and to make sure that priorities are clear. So be careful and be cautious. And if you see any kind of infighting or communication difficulties between business and engineering teams, a great tool that we've found is what's called mob programming. And so you get everyone in a room and you start developing software together. And there's a great Woody Zuill, Zuill, has some great videos on how to do mob programming. But then that way we're focusing on communication, and we're, again, all working in the same direction rather than kind of pushing each other back and forth where we're not going to make any progress. So another thing is making sure that you're monitoring your software. And so the term that you want to use, a lot of times in software, it's like you just need to know that right term to Google. And so if you look up static analysis tools and then whatever tech stack you're using, so if you're using Java or if you're using .NET C# or if you're using PHP, some of the ones that we use at Corgibytes, we're a big fan of Code Climate, and Code Climate works well with Ruby and Python, I think a couple others. And then we use NDepend for .NET projects. There's also SonarQube. There is Sonatype. There's literally hundreds of different static analysis tools. So looking at which ones are going to work, making sure that you're running reports regularly. A lot of them are able to be customized, so building dashboards and things like that, and just making sure that you're monitoring and kind of doing that on a regular basis so that you can see how your code base is improving. Leaning on automation for kind of 3 different areas of your software. So testing, which we talked about a little bit, and then also deployment. So making sure that your deployment process is as automated as possible instead of being manual. And so that means that, if you find a vulnerability, you can deploy it, you can patch it and get it deployed quickly. A lot of times what we see is that companies will have manual deployment processes and they're documented, but a lot of times it's out of date. And sometimes it'll take days for somebody who's new to come in and actually get a development environment set up and then get a change deployed. And so really focusing on streamlining your deployment process, and then also integration as well, that kind of goes along with it. And then also reducing the software complexity. So this means that, like if you want to find, a specific tool in the tool shed, things are organized, and that's going to help your workflow so much. And the same is true with software. Making sure that engineers are committed to writing clean code, to cleaning up their messes. So, we call them artifacts of entropy, right? So, entropy is the scientific process of things becoming chaotic and messy. And we have to actively fight entropy when we're building software. It's just kind of one of the principles. There is stuff that kind of comes up. So just like if we're living in a house, things become messy and we have to actively create processes like every Saturday I'm going to make sure I clean, or every time after I eat dinner I'm not going to leave dishes in the sink, right? So we create these kind of internal rules and we make sure that people know that it's a priority, and that is going to reduce the complexity. It's going to make your code much better to work with. It's going to help you attract better talent. The best developers that I know love working in clean code bases, and they love keeping their code bases clean. So making sure that you're encouraging that from a strategic standpoint, and that you don't see it as a waste of money, because it's actually the exact opposite. It's one of the things that can help keep you ahead. And so on the people side, I'll let Ashley, you take this one on.
So one of the things that Andrea just said that I think kind of covers everything that we're talking about here in terms of knowing your assets and your people from both the technical and people side is that as a leader, you need to get all of the teams within your organization understanding that you're on the same team, that you all have the same goal of protecting your organization, and that everybody can do that in their own way. And that part of the challenge is finding or avoiding that power dynamic struggle that she mentioned and getting departments to work together. And you do that through like cultivating relationships and trying to get the different departments to develop these symbiotic relationships. I heard of one of our clients who did these like town hall style meetings every month or so, where everybody from the organization was encouraged to come together and like share things they were working on and ask questions of leadership. And it really created this unified, open, transparent environment. So people felt comfortable asking questions. They understood more about what each department was working on. And if you can get departments to understand one another better, like she was saying, like business and engineering teams don't necessarily align or understand what the other is going for. But if you can get that to happen, then, you know, when the IT team requests something, the other teams aren't going to be like, oh, it's just the nerds over there asking for that. You know, they're going to understand that there's an actual business reason behind the request or behind the mandate or behind the policy change. So relationships within your organization could be your greatest asset towards a more secure network. And one of the ways that you can help develop those relationships is by encouraging feedback and open communication between everyone. You know, and as one of the leaders, as one of the executives, you can start asking for feedback across the board. You know, ask for feedback from your incident response team. You know, what are people reporting? What are the problems we're seeing? Ask for feedback from your managers. What are team members struggling with? Ask your users, what do you want to learn more about? What don't you know about? What content that we're training you with is working and what isn't? What don't you understand about what our security team is doing? You know, keeping that ongoing dialogue between the techs, the execs, and all of the end users will help. And will help you not only understand your own company's culture, but will help create that culture of security and openness that you need. One of the things that you need to convey to everybody within your organization is that security is not an end goal. It is not something that you achieve. You don't patch your software and you're like, oh, I'm good, I'm done. You don't train your users once a year and you're like, oh, I'm secure. I always equate security to healthy living. You know, you can't just like exercise 4 times a year and expect your body to benefit from that. You can't just eat vegetables like once a month and be like, I'm healthy. You know, it's a continuous way of life. It's part of that continuous improvement that Andrea was just talking about. You have to do these things continuously in order to maintain. And you can improve it. You can run faster. You can eat more vegetables. You can drink more water. You can, you know, have more monitoring tools. You can train your employees more. You can cut back on phishing clicks. But it's not something that you're ever going. There's not like an end goal that you're reaching. It's just a continuous way of life. So that's something that you need to convey to your entire organization, is that security is not something we achieve, it's something we practice.
Yeah, I love that. It's not something we achieve, it's something we practice. So how can we stay ahead of the problem? So, you know, if you've bought in, you're like, okay, I know I need to, you know, start improving security at my organization. We're recording this in October, so this tends to be the time of year that people start thinking about budgets and strategic planning. So as you're going through that process, how can you stay ahead? And so part of it is, you know, looking at your security awareness, education, and training. And so, you know, again, I'll let Ashley kind of take this on.
So human threats human error is the biggest threat that organizations face today. I read this Gartner study that said that 99% of firewall breaches were caused by misconfigurations and not a problem with the firewall. Well, who is doing the misconfiguring? People. And the 2017 Verizon Data Breach Report said that the majority of data breaches leverage stolen or weak passwords. Well, who's creating the passwords? People. So your people, the PEBCAC, the problem exists between keyboard and chair, they are what's standing between your networks and your data and the bad guys. So empower them with education. Give them the tools they need in order to be able to protect and defend your organization's data, money, reputation, all of the things. So first question is, who do you educate? Everyone. There's no one who is above education or learning more, or who's above policy and can learn more about behaving properly online. And then what do you educate them about? That's often a big question we get from clients, is like, I don't know where to start. Well, what you need to do a needs assessment. You do risk assessment all the time, or you do an audit with software to see where your vulnerabilities are. Do the same thing with your users. What is the problem that you're facing? Do you have a badge problem? Do you have a tailgating problem? Do you have a phishing? Everyone has a phishing problem. Do you find what the problems are and start there and then expand? Some of the biggest topics that are resonating with clients today would be the insider threat, because like I said, human error, you can be an insider and not even know it. Human error is the biggest problem. Social engineering and phishing, obviously, APTs, strong password practices, and then non-technical security policies and practices, such as shredding and clean desk policy and things that can lead to error. So I'm going to bring this right back to the car metaphor from earlier. You've just bought a brand new Lexus. It is fancy, top of the line. It has heated seats. It has your mirror that looks in the back. You have all of the safety features that they could possibly offer. And your teenage daughter wants to take it on a road trip with her friends. Are you going to let her take it anywhere if she hasn't, or if you don't know that she understands and abides by the road rules? If she hasn't studied for and passed her driver's ed test, and if she doesn't show you every single day that she can be a responsible driver. So now just remember that this isn't a car we're talking about, but it's your organization's networks, devices, data, customer information, and your brand reputation. Are you going to let uneducated users have their way with it, or are you going to empower them with the information that will help protect them and you? And I just want to end on this note. We say this all the time to our clients. Your users, and you for that matter, don't need to be experts. You don't need to know how to drive, or you don't need to know how cars work in order to be a good driver. You don't need to know how to change your oil in order to be a safe driver. It's the same thing with the internet. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to know when and how to call them. And so
I think we have that on this one. Like, who are you going to call? And we say that a lot with Corgibytes too, where it's, if you don't know, give us a call and we're happy to kind of walk you through it. And then one last thing is, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And so, the main takeaways, and then also some other security considerations for you, is remember that security in software is not just one thing. It's a mix of the people, the process, and the technology. So make sure that you're focusing on initiatives that address all three. There's also different types of testing. So we didn't even really touch on too much penetration or pen testing. There's, physical, cyber, and human. Network monitoring, identity access management, encryption, backups and source control, mobile device management. These are all different things. If you're just looking for, these are some terminology things that may be useful for you to just Google or, ask about, because these sometimes come up in discussions about security and are a little bit more on the technical side. So it's worth just mentioning, and get curious and recognize that you have the capacity to learn about this stuff. I know for me, for the longest time, I was thinking, I'm just a marketing person. I'm not going to be able to understand these things. But that was actually holding me back, and it was holding my company back. So recognizing that you have a growth mindset, that your brain can change, that you're capable of learning these things, and then it's like Ashley said, rethinking your hiring practices in order to find the right mix of technical talent. And so it's not necessarily that you have to be a security expert. It's just you need to know when to call them. So, who you're going to call, you can start with Ashley or myself. We're more than happy to kind of get you pointed in the right direction. And so here are some resources for you to get started. We've got stuff on the Corgibytes blog, and then also the SAC blog. And then Security Awareness Company also has a really great resource library. Did you want to touch on that, Ashley?
Yeah, if you go to our resource library, just go to our main website, and it's in the drop-down menu. It has resources for people in charge of planning, launching, and managing security awareness programs. And there's just tons of information there available to anybody who might find themselves not really knowing where to start.
Yeah, it's really, really good stuff. So thank you all so much. If you have any, and I think we might have a little bit of time for questions. I'll leave this up. Now, Ashley, I've got mine up on full screen. So let me see if we have any questions. If anybody has any questions, you can use this time to add them in the little Q&A box. Let's see here. Try to pull up Zoom. Ashley, are you able to pull up Zoom?
Yeah, I don't see any right now.
You don't see any? Okay.
Maybe we answered all of them.
Yeah, so maybe we answered them all, but thank you all very much. We're coming up right on the hour. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, to email us, and we're more than happy to get you started in the right direction, because you're not the only person who's struggling with this stuff. I think that's the main takeaway.
Yeah, everyone is. This is across the board, and it's one of those things that it's really easy to have fall to the bottom of the to list, but don't let it. But make this a priority. Make this software security. And this is the last day. October is security awareness or cybersecurity awareness month. So making sure that you're really making this an important part of your overall technology strategy and your overall growth for 2018. Yeah. Best of luck, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. Hope you found this useful, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.